My dad looked at me across the kitchen table and said we couldn't even afford an economy ticket for me on our Christmas trip, stating it calmly, like I was supposed to be grateful he'd thought it through at all. I didn't argue. I never did. I smiled, nodded, and said, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll find my own way," because that was the role I'd learned to play my entire adult life. A few hours later, while I was packing away decorations, I'd paid for my phone, buzzed, and I saw my brother's post from the business class lounge. Champagne glasses raised, my parents smiling beside him, like this had always been the plan. Then his text came through, casual and cruel at the same time. "Christmas is better without you." That was when it hit me that they hadn't been honest, that they weren't financially strapped, that they had simply decided I wasn't worth the seat. And as I stood at the airport holding that realization in my chest, a pilot approached me quietly and said, "Ma'am, your jet is ready." When they returned home after the holidays, I was already gone along with everything that had ever been mine. But I need to take you back to the moment before that text arrived, before I understood the full weight of what my family had chosen. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon from the candles I'd bought last week. The tree in the corner was decorated with ornaments I'd collected over the years, each one wrapped carefully and stored in boxes I'd organized myself. My father sat at the head of the table, hands folded, speaking in that measured tone he always used when he wanted me to accept something without questioning it. He explained the situation as if it were simple mathematics. Flights were expensive during the holidays. They had already committed to certain costs. There simply wasn't room in the budget for a fourth ticket. My mother sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, tracing invisible patterns with her finger. She didn't add anything. She rarely did when these conversations happened. My brother wasn't even in the room. He didn't need to be. His presence was always felt even when he was absent, like a space that had been carved out and protected long before I was old enough to notice. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one had asked me if I could contribute to the cost of my own ticket. No one had wondered aloud if there might be another solution. The decision had been made before I entered the room, and my role was simply to understand. I said what I always said. I told them it was fine. I told them I would figure something out. My father nodded, looking relieved, and my mother finally met my eyes with something that might have been gratitude or might have been guilt. I couldn't tell anymore. Those two emotions had worn the same face in this house for as long as I could remember. After they left the kitchen, I stayed behind to clean up the coffee cups they'd left on the table. It wasn't asked of me. It never was. But I'd learned early that being useful was the only currency that bought me any space in this family. If I was helpful, I was tolerated. If I was helpful and quiet, I was almost welcomed. The evening passed slowly. I wrapped the last of the Christmas gifts I'd purchased for them, even though I wouldn't be there to watch them open anything. I'd bought my father a new wallet because he was falling apart. I'd found a scarf for my mother in the shade of blue she always admired, but never bought for herself. For my brother, I'd chosen a book he'd mentioned wanting months ago, back when he still occasionally spoke to me about things that weren't transactional. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I finally sat down on the couch and opened my phone. Social media was filled with holiday photos, families gathered around tables, children in matching pajamas, couples holding hands in front of decorated trees. I scrolled past all of it without really seeing any of it until one image stopped me cold. My brother had posted from the business class lounge at the airport. The photo showed him holding a glass of champagne, his smile wide and easy. Behind him, my parents sat in leather chairs, looking more relaxed than I'd seen them in months. My mother was laughing at something off camera. My father had his arm around her shoulders. They looked like a family on vacation. They looked complete. The timestamp said the photo was taken 2 hours ago. 2 hours. That meant they had left for the airport while I was still in the house, wrapping their gifts, believing the story I'd been told. They hadn't said goodbye. They hadn't mentioned they were leaving that evening. They had simply gone as if I were a piece of furniture they'd remember to deal with later. I stared at that photo for a long time. I counted the champagne glasses. I noted the quality of the lounge, the way the lighting made everything look expensive and exclusive. Business class, not the economy, not even the budget option my father had claimed was beyond their means. They had chosen the premium experience for themselves and offered me nothing at all. Then my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. Just 5 words, but they carried the weight of everything I had tried not to see for 30 years. "Christmas is better without you." I read that message 3 times. Each time I waited for the sting to arrive, for the tears to come, for the familiar ache of rejection to settle into my chest. But something different happened instead. I felt a door close inside me quietly and permanently. Not with anger or drama, but with a kind of clarity I had never experienced before. They weren't struggling. They weren't making difficult choices. They had simply decided that I wasn't worth including, and they had lied to my face to avoid the discomfort of saying it directly. Every sacrifice I had made, every time I had stepped back to make room for everyone else, every moment I had spent being the easy child who never asked for too much, all of it had been met with this: a seat on a plane that was never reserved for me. A family photo that didn't include my face. A holiday where my absence was the gift they gave themselves. I put down my phone and looked around the living room. The tree, the decorations, the carefully arranged presents under the branches, all of it suddenly looked different, like props in a play I had been performing without realizing no one was watching. For the first time in my life, I didn't reach for an explanation that would make their behavior acceptable. I didn't search for the excuse that would let me forgive them by morning. I simply sat with this truth of what had happened and let it settle into my bones. They had made their choice. Now it was time to make mine. I stood up slowly, walked to my bedroom, and began to pack. Not for a trip I would beg my way onto. Not for a desperate attempt to catch a last-minute flight. I packed for something else entirely, something that had been waiting for me to be ready. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to learn, was that I had stopped being the daughter who needed their permission years ago. I had built something of my own while they weren't looking. I had created a life they knew nothing about because they had never asked and I had never offered. Tomorrow, I will be at the airport too. But I wouldn't be standing at the gate hoping for a seat they'd decided I didn't deserve. I would be walking toward a different terminal, a different future, and a truth none of them were prepared to face. The easy child was done being easy, and by the time they realized what that meant, I would already be gone. Growing up, I was described the same way so often that the words stopped sounding like compliments and started sounding like explanations for why I could be overlooked. She's so independent. She doesn't ask for much. She's the easy one. My parents said these things to relatives at family gatherings, to teachers at school conferences, to neighbors who commented on how well-behaved I seemed. They said them with a kind of relief in their voices, as if my existence required so little from them that they could barely believe their luck. What no one understood was that I learned to be easy because being difficult never got me anything but disappointment. When I was 6 years old, I asked for a bicycle for my birthday. My brother had gotten one the year before, bright red with streamers on the handles, and I had watched him ride it around the neighborhood for months before working up the courage to ask for my own. My father told me bicycles were expensive and that I should wait. My birthday came and went. The next year, I asked again. By then, I had stopped expecting the answer to be yes, but some small part of me still hoped. I received a second-hand bike from a garage sale 3 months later, its paint chipped and its chain rusty. I thanked my parents and never mentioned that it was nothing like the one I had wanted. My brother was different from the beginning. He was the first child, the son, the one who carried our father's name and our family's expectations. When he succeeded at something, the whole house celebrated. When he struggled, resources were redirected to help him. His baseball games were scheduled on the family calendar in ink. His parent-teacher conferences were attended by both parents. His graduation party took over the backyard with catering and guests I didn't recognize. Mine took place at a restaurant where we split the bill. I don't tell this story to paint myself as a victim. I tell it because I need you to understand the texture of the life I lived before I walked away from it. The inequality wasn't dramatic or obvious to outsiders. It lived in small moments that accumulated over years until they formed a shape I couldn't ignore anymore. It was the way my mother remembered my brother's clothing sizes, but had to ask me mine. It was the way my father drove an hour to watch my brother's college games, but forgot I had applied to graduate school until I mentioned I'd been rejected. I learned to stop mentioning things. I learned that sharing my hopes gave my family the opportunity to disappoint me, so I kept them to myself. When I got my first real job after college, I didn't announce it at dinner. I just started showing up to family gatherings with answers ready for when they finally noticed I was employed. When I rented my first apartment, I moved without asking for help. I bought my own furniture at thrift stores and assembled it alone because the alternative was asking for assistance that would come with conditions I didn't want to accept. The family narrative was clear. My brother was the one who needed investment. He was complicated, sensitive, full of potential that required nurturing. I was the sturdy one, the practical one, the daughter who would land on her feet no matter what. They didn't realize that my feet had hit the ground so many times that I had stopped feeling the impact. They didn't understand that my independence wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival strategy. Relatives reinforced this dynamic without realizing what they were doing. At every family reunion, aunts and uncles asked about my brother first. How was his job? Had he gotten that promotion? Was he still dating that lovely girl? When they finally turned to me, the questions were simpler, less interesting. And you? How are things? Fine, I would say. Things are fine. No one ever asked for details, and I never offered them. I remember a Thanksgiving when I was 24. My brother had just announced he was buying a house with help from our parents. The whole family congratulated him, asked about the neighborhood, and made jokes about housewarming gifts. I sat at the end of the table eating turkey and thinking about the lease I had just signed on an apartment I would furnish with whatever I could afford. No one asked where I was living now. No one knew I had moved 3 months earlier. After dinner, my mother found me in the kitchen doing dishes. She touched my shoulder and said something that she probably meant as kindness. "I'm glad you're so independent, sweetheart. You've never needed us the way your brother does." I didn't answer. What could I say? That I had needed them desperately and had simply stopped showing it, because showing it never worked. That every birthday where my gifts were afterthoughts, every holiday where my presence was optional, every achievement that went unacknowledged had taught me to expect nothing so that I would stop being hurt by receiving nothing. Instead, I dried the dishes and put them away in cabinets I had organized myself years ago when I noticed no one else was going to do it. That was the role I played, the one who noticed what needed to be done and did it without being asked or thanked. My brother never washed a dish in that house. He didn't know where the spare light bulbs were kept or how to reset the circuit breaker when the power went out. He called our father for those things, and our father came running. When I had problems, I was expected to solve them myself. When I solved them successfully, that success was used as evidence that I hadn't needed help in the first place. The logic was circular and impossible to escape. If I asked for help, I was being dramatic. If I didn't ask for help, I was proving I didn't need it. Either way, the conclusion was the same resources, attention, and love were limited commodities in my family, and my brother had first claim to all of them. I stopped fighting that reality sometime in my mid-20s. Fighting it required energy I needed for other things like building a life that didn't depend on their approval. I started putting money aside from every paycheck. I started learning skills that no one in my family had. I started treating their indifference not as a wound, but as a kind of strange freedom. If they expected nothing from me, then I owed them nothing in return. But the wound was still there, buried under years of practiced acceptance. Every time my father talked about my brother's accomplishments without mentioning mine, every time my mother forgot to call me on my birthday until the next day, every time I showed up to a family event and realized no one had noticed whether I would come or not, the Christmas trip was just the final example of a pattern that had repeated my entire life. My parents weren't broke. They had simply done the math that came naturally to them after all these years: 3 tickets for the people who mattered, and a convenient excuse for the one who could be left behind. What they didn't know was that I had been leaving for years already. I had been building something away from their attention, something that would be ready when I finally decided to stop pretending their treatment was acceptable. That Christmas, sitting alone in the house they had abandoned without saying goodbye, I realized I had been waiting for permission that was never going to come. I had been hoping for a change that they had no intention of making. I had been the easy child for 30 years, and all it had earned me was the certainty that I could be erased from their holiday photos without anyone missing me. So I decided to stop being easy, not with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful ultimatum, Just a quiet, permanent decision to stop pretending their love was something I could earn if I only tried harder. The daughter who never needed much was finally going to take everything she had been owed and walk away with it. There was a night not long after I started my first real job when I sat alone in my car in a parking garage and didn't move for an hour. I had just finished a 12-hour shift. My back ached and my feet were swollen, and I had eaten nothing but a granola bar since morning. But I didn't go home because home was a studio apartment with walls thin enough to hear my neighbors fighting, and the silence of my own space sometimes felt heavier than any exhaustion. I sat there with the engine off and the parking garage lights flickering above me, and I had a thought that changed everything. I realized I had spent my entire life waiting to be chosen, waiting for my parents to prioritize me, waiting for my brother to acknowledge me as an equal, waiting for anyone to look at my life and say that I mattered without conditions attached. That waiting had become so normal that I hadn't recognized it as waiting at all. I thought I was being patient. I thought I was being mature. I thought that someday, if I was good enough and quiet enough and helpful enough, the people who were supposed to love me would finally turn their attention my way. But sitting in that parking garage at nearly midnight, I understood something I had been avoiding for years. They weren't going to choose me. Not because I had done something wrong and not because I was unworthy of being chosen. Simply because they had already made their choices years ago, and those choices didn't include me at the center of anything. This realization didn't arrive with tears or rage. It came like the settling of dust after something has been disturbed and then left alone. I felt it in my chest, a quiet reorganization of everything I had believed about my family and my place in it. I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I was being overlooked by design, and I had been cooperating with that design my whole life. I drove home that night through empty streets and let myself feel the weight of what I had understood. My family had a shape, and I was at the edges of it. My brother was at the center, my parents arranged around him in supporting positions, and I existed somewhere in the margins, useful when needed, but never essential. I had spent decades trying to move closer to the center, trying to prove that I deserved a more prominent place, but the positions had been assigned long before I was old enough to compete for them. Knowing this didn't make me hate my family. Hatred would have required an energy I didn't have left to spare. What it did was release me from the hope that things would change. And that release strangely felt like the first gift I had given myself in years. I started making different decisions after that night. Small ones at first, so small that no one in my family noticed. I stopped volunteering for tasks that no one had asked me to do. I stopped being the first person to call after a family argument to smooth things over. I stopped explaining myself when my choices didn't match their expectations. These changes cost me more than I expected. My mother called less often when I wasn't the one initiating contact. My father seemed puzzled when I declined to help with projects around their house. My brother barely noticed, which told me everything I needed to know about how much my presence had registered in his life. But alongside the losses came something I hadn't anticipated: space. For the first time in my adult life, I had room to think about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed from me. I had hours that weren't devoted to managing other people's emotions or solving problems that were never acknowledged as problems. I had energy that had previously gone toward the bottomless task of earning love that was never going to be freely given. I started paying attention to my work in a way I hadn't before. My job wasn't glamorous. I was doing administrative work for a small real estate office, answering phones and organizing files and scheduling appointments for agents who barely remembered my name. But I began to notice things about the business that interested me: the way properties moved through the market, the calculations behind a successful investment, the difference between people who built wealth and people who stayed stuck in the same financial patterns their whole lives. I started asking questions when I had the chance. Not pushy questions, just curious ones. I asked the senior agents how they found properties that turned into profits. I asked the office manager how she had learned to read contracts. I asked anyone who would talk to me what separated people who understood money from people who spent their lives afraid of it. Most of them were surprised that I was interested. The administrative assistant wasn't supposed to have ambitions. She was supposed to answer the phones and file the documents and be grateful for the steady paycheck. But I had spent my whole life being underestimated, so their surprise didn't bother me. If anything, it felt familiar. I used my lunch breaks to read about real estate. I used my evenings to study for certifications that might open doors. I used my weekends to drive through neighborhoods and learn which blocks were improving and which were declining, training my eye to see what experienced investors saw without being taught. My family knew none of this. When they asked what I was doing with myself, which wasn't often, I gave them simple answers that required no follow-up questions. Work was fine. My apartment was fine. Everything was fine. They accepted these answers because they had never been particularly interested in the details of my life, and that lack of interest became the cover under which I rebuilt myself. There were moments when I wanted to tell them. When I passed a significant exam, I had the urge to call my mother and share the news. When I helped close my first deal as a licensed agent, I imagined my father's face if he knew what I had accomplished. But I had learned too well that sharing my achievements with them meant watching those achievements be minimized or compared unfavorably to whatever my brother had done. So I kept my victories private, letting them accumulate in silence, while my family continued to assume I was exactly what they had always believed me to be. The day I stopped waiting to be chosen was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no tearful declaration, no door slammed on my way out of their lives. It was simply a decision made alone in a parking garage after a long day of work, a decision to redirect all the energy I had been pouring into a hopeless cause towards something that might actually yield results. I didn't know then that I was laying the foundation for everything that came later. I didn't know that the woman who would one day board a private jet while her family flew commercial was being formed in those quiet hours of study and saving and slow, invisible growth. All I knew was that I was finished waiting for people who had proven they weren't coming. If I was going to have a place in this world, I would have to build it myself. And if my family wanted to know who I really was, they would have to start paying attention. But I wasn't going to hold my breath. The real estate office where I started my career was located in a strip mall between a nail salon and a sandwich shop. The carpet was worn, the coffee was always burnt, and the senior agents treated the support staff like furniture that occasionally needed dusting. My job was to answer phones, sort mail, update listings, and make myself useful enough to avoid being noticed for the wrong reasons. I was 26 years old and earning barely enough to cover my rent and car payment with nothing left over for savings. My parents knew I worked in real estate, but when they described my job to relatives, they made it sound like I was doing something temporary until I figured out what I really wanted. My brother had just been promoted at the bank where my father had connections, and family conversations centered on his trajectory while I faded into the background noise. I didn't mind being underestimated at home. By then, I had made peace with my family's limited imagination when it came to my potential. What surprised me was how much I didn't mind being underestimated at work either. The agents who ignored me gave me room to observe without interference. The tasks no one else wanted to do gave me access to every corner of the business. I learned the filing system, the contract templates, the relationships between landlords and tenants, buyers and sellers, banks and borrowers. I learned that real estate wasn't about houses. It was about information and timing and the ability to see value where others saw problems. A property that looked neglected to most people looked like a possibility to someone who understood what repairs cost and what rents could cover. A neighborhood that seemed declining to casual observers seemed like potential to someone who noticed the new businesses opening on the corners and the young families starting to move in. I started staying late after the office closed. Not to impress anyone, because no one was watching, but because the empty office gave me access to resources I couldn't afford on my own. I read through old transaction files, teaching myself how deals were structured and where they went wrong. I studied the properties that made money and the ones that didn't, looking for patterns that might help me understand what separated successful investments from disasters. The senior agents left their notes in the margins of documents. Some of those notes were careless or crude, but some of them contained insights that would have taken me years to figure out on my own. I copied the useful ones into a notebook I kept on my desk, building a private education from the scraps of knowledge that surrounded me. My salary was small, but I lived smaller. I stopped eating lunch out and started bringing food from home. I canceled subscriptions I didn't need and found free entertainment at the library. I drove my aging car past the point when most people would have traded it in learning basic maintenance to avoid mechanic bills I couldn't afford. Every month I put whatever I could into a savings account that grew so slowly I sometimes wondered if it was worth the sacrifice. During this time, my family hosted gatherings where my brother's achievements were celebrated, and my existence was acknowledged with polite questions that required no real answers. "How's work?" they would ask, and I would say, "Fine," and that would be the end of it. They didn't want details. They wanted confirmation that I was managing my life without requiring anything from them, and I gave them that confirmation because it was easier than trying to explain what I was building. What I was building didn't look like much from the outside: a savings account that crept toward a goal I hadn't shared with anyone, a knowledge base constructed from late nights and borrowed resources, a network of contacts I was slowly developing by being reliable and helpful in ways that cost me nothing but time. I made myself indispensable to the agents who would let me. I volunteered to show properties when they were double booked. I sat in on inspections and learned what problems looked like before they became expensive. I accompanied nervous first-time buyers and learned how to explain complicated processes in simple terms. None of this was in my job description, and none of it came with extra pay, but all of it was education I couldn't have afforded to purchase. My parents would have told me I was being taken advantage of. They would have said I was wasting my time doing work I wasn't compensated for. But they had never understood that compensation takes many forms, and the knowledge I was gaining would eventually be worth more than any hourly wage. 3 years into my time at that office, I had saved enough for a down payment on a small property. Not enough for anything impressive, just enough for a starter home in a neighborhood that most investors avoided. The house was old and needed work. The block had a reputation for being challenging. The numbers looked marginal at best, but I had spent 3 years studying exactly this kind of property. I knew what repairs would cost because I had watched agents negotiate with contractors for years. I knew what rent the neighborhood could support because I had analyzed comparable listings until I could price a property in my sleep. I knew the risks, and I knew that the biggest risk was staying where I was waiting for opportunities that would never come to people who only took safe bets. I bought the house without telling my family. There was no announcement, no request for advice, no celebration. I signed the papers, received the keys, and stood alone in the empty living room of a property that was entirely mine for the first time in my life. The floors were scarred, the kitchen cabinets hung crooked, the bathroom fixtures were older than I was. But when I looked around that space, I didn't see problems. I saw the first tangible evidence that my strategy was working. I saw proof that the woman my family had dismissed as the easy child, the independent one who never needed anything, was capable of building something they had never imagined. I spent the next 6 months working on that house, nights after my regular job, weekends when other people my age were socializing or relaxing. I painted walls and replaced fixtures and learned to do things I had never done before, because hiring someone to do them would have eaten into margins I couldn't afford to lose. My family didn't know about any of it. They didn't ask, and I didn't offer. By the time I found my first tenant and collected my first rent check, I had proven something to myself that mattered more than their approval ever had. I could create value where others saw none. I could build something from nothing. And I could do it completely alone without the support of the people who had spent my whole life assuming I wasn't capable of anything significant. That first house was the foundation. What I built on top of it would eventually change everything. The first month with my rental property, the sewer line collapsed. I didn't know what a sewer line was until a plumber explained why raw sewage was backing up into the basement of a house I had just finished painting. The repair cost $4,000 I didn't have charged to a credit card, with an interest rate that made me nauseous every time I thought about it. They would have called this predictable. They would have said I was foolish to buy property I couldn't afford to maintain. They had always assumed I belonged in a safe small box. But I had stopped caring what my family would have said. They didn't know about the house. They didn't know that I spent 3 days sleeping in 4-hour shifts between my regular job and the work of cleaning a basement that smelled like everything had gone wrong at once. I cried once during that first month. It happened at 2 a.m. alone in a house that suddenly seemed like the stupidest decision I had ever made. I sat on the floor and let the tears come. Then I stopped crying and got back to work. My whole life had been training for moments when giving up would have been easier than continuing. The sewer line was fixed. The credit card balance sat there like a wound that would take months to heal. I found my first tenant, a young nurse. She paid her rent on time. Every month when her check arrived, I felt the balance shift slightly back toward possibility. My second year with the property was better. The major repairs had been addressed. I refinanced to a better interest rate and started putting the difference toward my next down payment. I calculated returns and risks with a precision they never suspected. Family dinners came and went. My brother at the center, my parents orbiting his stories. I gave them simple answers when asked, confirming I was managing my life without requiring anything from them. My independence had become the cover under which I built an entirely different life. By my fourth year in real estate, I owned 3 properties. The first house performing reliably, a duplex that had taken everything I had saved, and 6 months of terrifying negative cash flow. A small commercial space that a local coffee shop leased. I learned how to read people, how to negotiate with contractors, and how to walk into a room where I was the youngest person and make my voice heard without apology. The real estate office where I started was a memory. I managed my own growing portfolio. My family noticed I had more flexibility, though they attributed it to the wrong causes. My brother asked me once what I actually did for work, and when I started to explain, his eyes glazed over. What they didn't know was that by the time that Christmas came around, I was worth more on paper than both of my parents combined. I had built something substantial while they weren't watching, using the self-reliance they had fostered. The daughter who never needed much had learned to generate her own abundance. The easy child had become someone they would eventually have to reckon with. And on that holiday, when they decided I wasn't worth the price of a seat on their flight, they had no idea who they were leaving behind. The season felt like a reminder of something I was adjacent to, but never fully part of. My parents called a family meeting in early December to discuss the holiday plans. This was unusual. The destination was a ski resort in Colorado suggested by my brother. When my father sat me down to explain, his tone was the familiar measured delivery. Flights were expensive, lodging was costly. There simply wasn't room in the budget for a 4th person. I nodded. He showed no discomfort. He believed I would believe it. My mother sat nearby, silent. Her eyes met mine briefly, then slid away. She knew the decision had been made, and her role was to let it happen. My brother wasn't present. His place was never in question. I said what I always said I understood. I would figure out something for myself. I told them to have a wonderful time and not to worry about me. The automatic script. But I watched my father's relief. He was pleased the exclusion had gone smoothly. In the days that followed, the lie about affordability became obvious. New luggage appeared. Ski equipment was inspected. My mother mentioned a new coat. They were investing in an experience they valued. My brother posted photos of their suite. I didn't confront anyone. Confrontation had always resulted in me being told I was overreacting. I focused on my own plans. The week before they left, my mother mentioned the house would need someone to collect the mail. I agreed, recognizing the request. The only role designated for me was caretaker of an empty house. On the day of their departure, my family left without saying goodbye. When I came home, I found the house key slipped under my door. That key sat on my kitchen counter. I was reliable enough to be given responsibility, but not valued enough to be given inclusion. Outside my window, Christmas lights blinked. Inside, the thoughts that had finally stopped pretending to be peaceful settled. Tomorrow, my family will be in Colorado. Tomorrow, I will be here. But something had changed in me. The easy child was finally done being easy, and the quiet daughter was about to move. The airport on the day before Christmas was chaos organized into lines. Families hauling luggage, children crying from exhaustion, business people weaving through crowds with the practiced efficiency of frequent travelers. I arrived early enough to watch the sun finish rising through the terminal windows, painting everything in shades of gold that seemed too beautiful for the knot of anticipation in my chest. My family didn't know I would be there. They had left for the airport, assuming I was at home, probably starting my holiday tradition of watching old movies alone while eating takeout that no one else wanted to share. They had given me no information about their flight because they had no reason to think I needed it. I was excluded, and excluded people don't require details. I found them near the check-in counter for their airline, recognizable from a distance by my brother's height and my father's distinctive posture. My mother was fussing with a carry-on bag, reorganizing something that probably didn't need reorganizing. They looked like any other family preparing for a holiday trip, absorbed in their own logistics and oblivious to everything outside their immediate concerns. I watched them for a moment before approaching, giving myself time to confirm what I already knew. No one was looking around the terminal, wondering if I might appear. No one had saved a space in their group where I might fit, if I had somehow found a way to join them. I was absent from their holiday, not because of circumstance, but because of choice, and that choice had been made deliberately by people who were supposed to love me. My father saw me first. His expression shifted from recognition to confusion in the space of a heartbeat, his mouth opening to ask a question he didn't have time to form before I had crossed the remaining distance. "I wanted to see you off," I said, keeping my voice neutral. It was partially true. I did want to see them, but not for the reasons they would assume. My mother recovered faster than my father, stepping forward to give me a hug that felt perfunctory and surprised. My brother hung back his phone already out, probably documenting something for social media. He nodded in my direction but didn't speak. "That's sweet of you," my mother said, pulling back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I was in the area," I lied smoothly, "and I wanted to wish you a good trip." My father had regained his composure by then resuming his role as the person who managed family logistics. He checked his watch, mentioned something about boarding times, and gestured vaguely toward the security line. The message was clear: this unexpected appearance was disrupting the schedule, and schedules were important to people who had places to be. I stayed where I was, letting them gather their things, watching the small choreography of a family preparing to leave one life behind for a vacation. My brother took a photo of the departure board, probably to prove they were doing something enviable. My mother did a final check of her bag. My father looked around the terminal with the satisfied expression of someone whose plans were proceeding exactly as expected. None of them asked what I would be doing for the holiday. None of them suggested, even performatively, that they wished I could join them. The space where those gestures might have lived remained empty, confirming everything I had already understood. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen, then looked back at my family with an expression I had practiced without meaning to, the calm face of someone who has stopped expecting anything. "I should go," I said. "I have somewhere to be." My mother nodded, already turning toward the security line. My father offered a distracted wave. My brother didn't look up from his phone. I walked away from them without hurrying, moving through the crowd toward a different part of the terminal. Behind me, I could feel their attention dissolving, their thoughts returning to their own concerns, their awareness of my presence fading like a sound that had never been loud enough to notice. The private aviation terminal was quieter than the main concourse, separated from the chaos of commercial travel by security protocols and price points that most people never encountered. I showed my identification at the desk, confirmed my booking, and waited while the staff made whatever arrangements needed to be made for someone departing on their own aircraft. The pilot found me in the waiting area, a professional woman in a crisp uniform who addressed me with the casual respect I had started to encounter in spaces like this. "Ma'am, your jet is ready whenever you'd like to board." I thanked her and gathered my things, following her through the terminal toward the tarmac, where a small aircraft waited with its door open and its engines preparing for departure. I didn't look back toward the main terminal where my family was probably passing through security, by now removing shoes and arranging belongings and thinking about the vacation that awaited them. I didn't need to see them to know they hadn't noticed my departure any more than they had noticed my arrival. The jet was modest by the standards of private aviation, but incomprehensible by the standards of my childhood. I had chartered it for a business trip that coincidentally overlapped with the holiday, a meeting with potential investors in a property development that could transform my portfolio. The timing was fortunate, but fortune favors preparation, and I had been preparing for years. As the aircraft lifted off and the city fell away beneath us, I thought about what my family would learn when they returned from their vacation. They would return to find me gone, not just absent from the house where they expected me to collect their mail, but gone in a more permanent way. I had spent the past month carefully removing from their lives everything that had ever been mine. The furniture I had purchased for their home, bought during years when I was still trying to earn a place in a family that had never intended to give me one. The decorations I had collected. The practical investments I had made in their comfort, thinking that generosity might eventually be repaid with belonging. All of it was gone now, donated or sold, or simply removed to spaces where my contributions would be appreciated. What remained in their house was what they had paid for themselves, which was less than they would have guessed before they started looking. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it to stop hurting myself. Every item I left behind was a reminder of years spent believing I could purchase love from people who had never been selling. Removing those reminders was the first step toward building a life where my value wasn't determined by the people who had spent decades telling me I had none. The clouds below us looked like a landscape from a dream, solid enough to imagine walking across, but insubstantial enough to disappear at the slightest touch. I watched them for a while, thinking about all the years I had spent standing on ground that felt equally uncertain. My family would have questions when they discovered what I had done. They would probably be angry, maybe confused, possibly hurt in ways they hadn't expected to be. But they had forfeited the right to my explanations, the same way they had forfeited my presence gradually through countless small decisions that had accumulated into a distance too great to cross. I settled back in my seat and let the engines carry me toward whatever came next. Behind me, my family was flying business class to a ski resort, celebrating a holiday that deliberately excluded me. Ahead of me was something I had built entirely on my own, something they hadn't known about, and couldn't touch something that would be waiting for me when I landed. For the first time in 30 years, I was exactly where I belonged. The hotel where I stayed for my business meetings was nothing like the spaces I had occupied as a child. High ceilings, neutral tones, windows that looked out over a city I had traveled to on my own terms. I spent the first morning reviewing documents and making calls, conducting business that would have baffled the family who had dismissed me as someone without ambitions or abilities. My phone showed the missed calls and unread messages I had expected. My mother first confused, then worried, then something approaching frantic. My father authoritative at first and increasingly uncertain as his calls went unanswered. My brother, late to the pattern as always, reached out only after it became clear that something unusual was happening. I read their messages without responding, not because I was punishing them, though they might have interpreted it that way, but because I had nothing to say that would make the situation easier for anyone. The conversations that needed to happen were not ones that could take place over text while I was trying to focus on the work that had brought me here. The meetings went well. The investors I met with were interested in my track record, impressed by the numbers I could show them, engaged by the opportunities I presented. These were people who judged value by results rather than relationships, who didn't care about my family history or my place in any hierarchy I hadn't built myself. They saw what I had accomplished, and what I had accomplished spoke for itself. Between meetings, I thought about what was happening back home. My family would have landed by now, would have made their way to the resort, and would be starting the vacation they had planned without me. At some point, someone would have tried to reach me again and noticed the pattern of unanswered calls. At some point, curiosity would have turned to concern, and concern would have begun its slow transformation into alarm. I didn't feel guilty about their discomfort. This surprised me slightly because guilt had been my constant companion for as long as I can remember. I had felt guilty for asking too much, guilty for not being enough, guilty for occupying space in a family that seemed to wish I occupied less of it. But watching my phone fill with their attempts at contact, I felt only a quiet clarity about what I was doing and why. The third day of my trip, my mother left a voicemail that I listened to while looking out at the city lights. Her voice was different than I had ever heard it, stripped of the measured calm she usually maintained. She said they had called the house and no one answered. She said they had asked neighbors to check on me and learned I wasn't there. She said they didn't understand what was happening and needed me to call them back. I saved the voicemail without returning the call. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because any response I gave would have been pulled into the same patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. She would have asked questions designed to make me explain myself. She would have offered concern that was also accusation. She would have found ways to make my absence about her feelings rather than about my choices. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. The silence continued through Christmas Day. I ate breakfast alone in a restaurant that catered to business travelers, people who were also spending the holiday away from whatever families they had or didn't have. The food was good, and the service was professional, and no one asked me why I was alone or suggested I should feel sad about it. My phone buzzed periodically with messages I didn't read immediately. I had set boundaries around my attention, protecting the peace I had found in this space away from expectations. There would be time to address everything when I returned. For now, I was giving myself permission to simply exist without the weight of their disappointment pressing down on me. The investors I had met with sent follow-up emails expressing interest in moving forward. The numbers we had discussed would require refinement, but the foundation was solid. I had built something real, something that continued to grow, even when I wasn't watching it. Something that proved I was more than the role my family had assigned me. On the flight home, I thought about what I would find when I arrived. My apartment unchanged, waiting for me with the quiet reliability of a space that belonged only to me. My properties, managed by systems I had put in place, generated income that flowed regardless of whether my family approved of how I had earned it. My life, which had somehow become substantial without their knowledge or blessing. I also thought about what my family would find when they returned from their vacation. An empty house where certain things were missing. A daughter who had stopped waiting by the phone. A silence that said more than any words I could have spoken. They would have to sit with that silence for a while the way I had sat with their indifference for years. They would have to wonder what had changed and why. They would have to reckon with the possibility that the easy child had finally become difficult, not through tantrums or demands, but through the simple act of walking away. The plane landed smoothly, and I collected my things with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to travel light. Outside the terminal, the air was cold and clean familiar in ways I hadn't expected to appreciate. I was home, whatever that word meant now, in a life I had constructed from nothing while my family wasn't watching. My phone showed new messages from all three of them, the frequency increasing as the days of my silence accumulated. I would respond eventually. I would have conversations that couldn't be avoided forever. But not tonight, and not tomorrow, and not until I was ready to speak from a position of strength rather than apology. The silence had done its work. Now it was time to see what grew in the space it had cleared. My family returned from Colorado on a Tuesday afternoon. I know this because my mother sent me a text saying they had landed safely, the first message in days that didn't include a question or an accusation. Just a simple statement of fact, as if normalcy might be restored through the appearance of normal communication. I didn't respond. I was in a meeting with my property manager, reviewing the performance of my portfolio and discussing opportunities for the coming year. The numbers were strong. The decisions I had made were paying off. The life I had built was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with the family I had left behind. The silence from my phone lasted longer than I expected. I had assumed my family would escalate their attempts at contact once they were home, once they saw whatever they saw when they walked through their front door. But hours passed without new messages, then a full day, then another. When my mother finally called, her voice was different than it had been in any of the voicemails she had left during the holiday, smaller, somehow less certain of itself. "We're home," she said, "and we need to talk about some things." I had expected anger. I had prepared for accusations and demands for explanations. What I hadn't expected was this quiet tone, this carefulness, this sense that she was approaching a conversation she didn't know how to have. "I'm listening," I said. She paused for a long moment before continuing. "Some things are missing from the house. Furniture and decorations. Things we thought were ours but apparently weren't." "They were mine," I said simply. "I bought them. I paid for them. They belonged to me." Another pause, longer this time. We didn't realize how much of it was yours. I know, I said. That's part of the problem. The conversation didn't last much longer. My mother said she needed time to think, and I said I understood. She said my father was upset, and I said that was his right. She said my brother didn't understand what was happening, and I said that was consistent with his understanding of most things involving me. That last comment landed harder than I intended. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone encountering a version of her daughter she hadn't met before. The easy child, the one who smoothed over conflicts and apologized for things that weren't her fault, would have softened that statement, would have explained it away, would have made sure everyone's feelings were protected. But I wasn't that person anymore, and I wasn't going to pretend I was. In the days that followed, I learned what my family had discovered when they returned. The living room where I had arranged furniture I purchased with my own money over the years was largely empty. The kitchen where appliances and cookware I had bought sat on counters and in cabinets was notably bare. The guest room, which I had decorated because no one else would held only what had been there before, I started trying to make their house feel like a home. They hadn't realized how much of their comfortable life depended on my contributions. They had assumed the conveniences surrounding them were simply there the way walls and floors are there, part of the structure, rather than something someone had chosen and paid for and maintained. My father called me 2 days after my mother. His voice carried the tone he used when he was displeased, but trying to maintain control. "What you did was extreme," he said without preamble. "What was extreme was being told you couldn't afford a plane ticket while you flew business class without me," I replied. "What was extreme was being excluded from a family holiday and then being asked to collect your mail while you were gone. That's not the same thing." "You're right," I said. "It's not the same thing. My version involves taking back property I legally own. Your version involves lying to your daughter to avoid including her in something you decided she didn't deserve to be part of." The conversation deteriorated from there. My father wasn't accustomed to being challenged by me, and his responses showed how little he had prepared for this possibility. He fell back on authority and indignation tools that had worked when I was younger and still believed I needed his approval. But I had stopped needing his approval years ago. I had just stopped showing him that I had stopped. My brother reached out last a text message that arrived 3 days after my parents' calls. His message was brief and carried the tone of someone who felt inconvenienced by a situation that should have been resolved already. "Mom says you took all your stuff from the house. Kind of dramatic, don't you think?" I stared at that message for a long time, considering all the responses I could give. In the end, I chose not to respond at all. My brother had never been interested in understanding me before, and there was no reason to believe this situation would change that. He would interpret whatever I said through the lens he had always used, the one that placed him at the center of every family dynamic, and relegated me to a supporting role I had never auditioned for. The silence I gave him was the most honest communication we had shared in years. Weeks passed. The initial shock faded into a kind of wary distance. My parents called occasionally, their conversations careful, in ways they hadn't been before. They asked about my work, though they didn't really understand what I did. They mentioned family events happening in the future, though they didn't explicitly invite me. They were treating me like someone they had to manage, rather than someone they knew how to love. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't closed. It was simply the new reality, awkward and uncertain, and nothing like the relationship I had spent years hoping we might build. But maybe that was its own kind of progress. Maybe being treated as someone to manage was better than being treated as someone to ignore. Maybe the discomfort they now felt when talking to me was the beginning of something that could eventually become respect. I didn't know. I couldn't control what they felt or how they processed what had happened. I could only control my own choices, my own boundaries, my own life that continued to grow in directions they hadn't anticipated. And if they never came to understand me, if this new distance became permanent, I had already proven I could survive without their understanding. I had been surviving without it my whole life. The calls became more frequent in February. My mother's voice carried a new quality uncertainty that bordered on fear. She asked questions she had never asked when she assumed my presence was guaranteed. "Are you coming to your father's birthday next month?" "I haven't decided yet." Easter is late this year. Will you be around? I'm not sure about my schedule. We haven't seen you in a while. Do you want to come for dinner sometime? I'll let you know. My father handled the new dynamic by retreating into formality. He stayed on safe topics. He didn't apologize for the Christmas trip. He simply pretended the whole thing hadn't happened. My brother started posting more on social media, sharing photos of family dinners I hadn't been invited to. It was petty a sign he was feeling something he couldn't name. I watched these posts from a distance. The family dynamics that had once caused me so much pain now seemed irrelevant to the life I was building. That life continued to expand. The investment fund I had been developing gained its first institutional partner. The property portfolio reached a value that would have seemed impossible. I had stopped trying to help them catch up to who I was now. In March, my mother asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. She talked about the Christmas trip, acknowledging my father had made the decision without consulting her. She said she had felt uncomfortable but hadn't spoken up. She had been thinking a lot about the years when I was growing up. I didn't realize how much we were leaning on you, she said quietly. I didn't see it until you stopped being there to lean on. What do you want me to do with that information? I asked. I just wanted you to know I've been thinking about it. I appreciate that. But thinking about something and changing it aren't the same thing. I know. I want to do better. I want to try. I told her, I hear you, but I'm not going to pretend things are fine when they're not. I'm not going back to being the person who made everything easy. She nodded slowly. What would it look like if we started over? She asked. It would have to start with everyone understanding that my place isn't negotiable anymore. I'm not the one who gets left behind. If there's not room for me at the table, then I'll build my own table. She was quiet for a long moment. You already have, haven't you? She said. Built your own table. Yes, I have. We finished our coffee in a silence that was different. I left feeling a quiet kind of hope. Hope that I could navigate whatever came next from a position of strength with boundaries I wouldn't abandon. The easy child was gone forever. The woman who remained was someone my family was only beginning to meet. The restaurant I chose for the family meeting was neutral territory, a place none of us had been before. I selected it deliberately, wanting a space that didn't carry the weight of memories, that didn't automatically position me as the child returning to parents who knew better. I arrived first and chose a table near the back, away from the window and the other diners. The waiter brought water and asked if I was expecting others. I said yes and watched the door while I waited. My mother came in first, looking around the unfamiliar room with an expression I recognized from her face when she encountered situations she hadn't prepared for. My father followed close behind, his posture suggesting he would rather be anywhere else. My brother arrived last, glancing at his phone even as he walked through the door. They found me without difficulty and arranged themselves in the chairs across the table. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was thick with things that hadn't been said and couldn't be unsaid. Thank you for coming, I said, taking control of the conversation, the way I had learned to take control of business negotiations. I asked for this meeting because there are things that need to be addressed directly. My father's expression tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being summoned anywhere, especially not by me. But he had agreed to come, which meant something, even if I wasn't sure what. We're here, he said. Say what you need to say. I had prepared for this moment, thinking through what I wanted to communicate and how. I knew that anger wouldn't serve me, that accusations would only trigger defensiveness, that the point wasn't to win an argument, but to establish something new. I want to talk about the family I grew up in, I began. Not to blame anyone or demand apologies, but to make sure we all understand the same history before we decide what happens next. My mother leaned forward slightly. Her attention focused in a way it rarely had been when I was growing up. My brother looked bored, but he was listening. My father kept his expression carefully neutral. I spent most of my childhood being told I was independent and didn't need much, I continued. I heard those words as praise for a long time before I realized they were actually permission. Permission to give me less attention, less support, less presence than other members of this family received. My brother started to speak, but I held up a hand. Let me finish. Then you can respond. He settled back, irritation visible in the set of his shoulders. The Christmas trip was not the first time I was excluded from something this family did together. It was just the most obvious example, the one that made me realize I had to stop pretending the pattern wasn't there. I looked at my father directly. "You told me you couldn't afford a ticket for me. You were lying." "I know that because I saw the business class lounge photos and I received the text from my brother saying Christmas was better without me." My mother's face went pale. My father's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I'm not interested in relitigating the past," I said. "I don't need anyone to apologize or admit they were wrong. What I need is for everyone at this table to understand that the dynamic we had before is over. I am not the easy child anymore. I am not the one who will accept whatever portion is offered because I'm grateful to be included at all." The silence that followed was heavy. My mother was the first to break it. "We didn't realize," she said softly. "I didn't realize how it looked from your side." I believe that, and I've spent a long time trying to understand why. Some of it was probably unconscious. Some of it was probably just convenience because I never caused problems, and problems were easier to notice than silence. My father cleared his throat. "What exactly do you want from us now?" It was a practical question, the kind he would ask in any negotiation. I appreciated the directness, even if it came without the emotional acknowledgement I might have wanted. "I want to know if there's a version of this family that includes me as an equal, not as someone who exists in the margins while someone else gets the center, not as someone who's invited when it's convenient and left out when it's not." "Of course you're equal," my mother said. But even as she spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She wanted it to be true. That wasn't the same as it being true. "I haven't felt equal in this family," I said. "Ever. And I'm not sure you know how to treat me as an equal because you've never practiced it." My brother finally spoke, his tone defensive. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like we deliberately tried to hurt you. We're a normal family. Sometimes things aren't perfect. That doesn't mean we're monsters." "I didn't say you were monsters. I said there was a pattern, and the pattern had consequences. The consequence is that I built a life you know nothing about because I couldn't trust you to be interested in it or supportive of it." "What life?" My brother asked, his confusion genuine. I could have explained then. I could have told them about the properties, the investments, the business I had created while they were paying attention to other things. I could have shown them the evidence of everything I had accomplished without their help or knowledge. But I chose not to. That information was mine, and sharing it would have shifted the conversation in ways I didn't want. This wasn't about proving my worth through financial success. It was about establishing that my worth existed regardless of what I had or hadn't achieved. "The life I live now," I said simply, "one that doesn't depend on your approval or participation." The meal arrived, giving us a natural pause. We ate in silence for a while, each of us processing the conversation differently. When I spoke again, my voice was calmer. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for awareness. When decisions are made about family events, I want to be considered. When resources are distributed, I want fairness. When someone in this family needs help, I want the same willingness to show up that's always been shown to others." My father set down his fork. "Those are reasonable requests. They shouldn't have to be requested, but they are because that's where we are." The conversation continued through the meal, touching on logistics and plans and the practical matters of family life. We discussed upcoming events and how I might be included. We talked about communication and the importance of actually talking instead of assuming. Nothing was resolved completely. That would have been too much to expect from a single conversation after 30 years of accumulated distance. But something had started a new chapter that might lead somewhere different from where we had been. When the meal ended, I gathered my things and stood to leave first. My mother reached for my hand and held it briefly. "I'm glad you asked for this," she said. "Me too," I replied. And I meant it. Walking out of the restaurant into the evening air, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because my family had changed, but because I had finally said the things I needed to say in my own voice, on my own terms. The daughter who had spent her life waiting for permission had finally stopped asking for it. The morning after the family meeting, I woke up early and lay in bed listening to the silence of my apartment. It was a different silence than the one I had known growing up, the silence of being alone in a house full of people who didn't see me. This was the silence of space I had created for myself, filled with things I had chosen and earned and built. I got up and made coffee the way I liked it, in a kitchen I had designed to my own specifications, in a home that belonged entirely to me. Through the window, the city was waking up, cars beginning their morning routes, people moving through their routines. I was one of them now, someone with a place in the world that no one had given her permission to occupy. The weeks that followed the family meeting were quieter than I expected. My parents called occasionally, their conversations more intentional than before. They asked questions about my work and seemed to listen to the answers. They invited me to a dinner at their house and made sure I knew the invitation was real. I went to the dinner, curious to see how things would feel in the space where I had grown up. The house looked different than I remembered, smaller and more ordinary than the setting of the stories I carried in my head. My mother had replaced some of the furniture I had taken, though the new pieces didn't match as well. My father moved through the rooms with a careful awareness that hadn't been there before. My brother was there too, maintaining the awkward distance that had become our norm. We exchanged pleasantries and avoided topics that might require honesty. It wasn't warmth, but it also wasn't the indifference I had grown up with. Something had shifted, even if neither of us knew what to call it. Over the months that followed, I discovered what rebuilding a relationship with my family actually looked like. It wasn't the triumphant reunion of a movie ending where past hurts are forgiven and everyone embraces as the music swells. It was smaller than that, and messier and more uncertain. My mother called to ask my opinion about things she had never consulted me about before. My father mentioned my name in conversations with relatives, as though I had always been someone worth mentioning. My brother texted me once about a property question, a small acknowledgement that I might know things he didn't. These were not the dramatic gestures I had imagined during all those years of feeling invisible. They were ordinary moments of inclusion, the kind that happen naturally in families where everyone feels like they belong. For me, they felt significant precisely because they were so normal. I didn't trust the change completely. Trust is built slowly, and I had learned too well how easily attention could be withdrawn, but I also didn't dismiss it entirely. The family I had was never going to be perfect, and I had stopped needing them to be. What I needed was the knowledge that I could survive without them, and I had that knowledge now. Everything else was a bonus. The business I had built continued to grow, requiring more of my attention and offering more rewards for that attention. I closed deals that would have seemed impossible to the woman I was 5 years ago. I built partnerships with people who respected my expertise and valued my contributions. I created wealth that had nothing to do with my family's approval and everything to do with my own capabilities. When people asked how I had become successful, I told them the truth. I had stopped waiting for someone to give me what I wanted and started building it for myself. I had taken the independence my family had assigned to me and made it actually mine. I had transformed the neglect of my childhood into the fuel for an adult life that no one could take away. The Christmas that had started everything became a story I could tell without pain, a turning point that looked different from the inside than it did from the outside. My family saw it as the moment when I became difficult, when I stopped being the easy child who smoothed over their choices and started holding them accountable. I saw it as the moment when I finally chose myself. There were times when I wondered if I had done the right thing, if the confrontation and the silence and the walking away had been worth the cost. Those doubts visited me late at night when the apartment was quiet and the certainties of daylight had faded. But then I would think about the alternative. I would think about another Christmas where I wasn't included, another family event where I was an afterthought, another year of building a life that no one bothered to notice. I would think about growing old in the same patterns, still hoping for attention that never came, still measuring my worth by standards I had never agreed to. And I knew that whatever I had lost by speaking up was less than what I would have lost by staying silent. The woman who had been told she didn't deserve a seat on the family trip now owned enough to charter her own aircraft when she needed one. The daughter, who had been dismissed as someone without ambition, had built something more substantial than anyone who dismissed her could have imagined. But those weren't the victories that mattered most. What mattered was something harder to measure, something that existed entirely inside me, the knowledge that I was worth valuing regardless of who agreed. I didn't win my family back, not in the way that phrase usually implies. I didn't convince them to love me the way I had always wanted to be loved. I didn't transform them into the parents and brother I had imagined when I was young enough to believe that families worked the way they were supposed to. What I won was myself, the right to take up space without apologizing, the freedom to have needs and expect them to be considered, the strength to walk away from situations that diminished me, even when those situations involved the people who were supposed to care for me most. If you're listening to this story because it sounds like something you have lived, I want you to know something important. You are not too much for wanting to be treated with respect. You are not difficult for refusing to accept less than you deserve. You are not selfish for building a life that doesn't depend on the approval of people who have shown you repeatedly that their approval comes with conditions you can never fully meet. The easy child is a role someone gave you. It is not who you are. You get to decide what happens next. You get to choose whether to keep waiting for permission or to start giving yourself the things you've been hoping someone else would offer. And if you've already started that journey, if you're somewhere in the middle of the hard work of becoming yourself, I want you to know that it's worth it. The person you find on the other side is someone worth meeting. She's been waiting for you to choose her all this time.